Now this illustration deals with motors in accordance with 230.90A exception 1. And notice the motor that you see there may be a motor for irrigation pump. And notice that the conductor sizing is in the quick calc 1. And notice 430.22 requires 125% of the motor's full load current, and 430.24 would apply if you had 2 or more motors on a feeder, or 2 or more motors on a feeder with other loads. But here we just have an individual motor, maybe supplying the irrigation pump, rocking horse for the oil company, whatever. But notice 125% of 120 amp full load current rating from table 430.250 for 3-phase motors, or 430.248 for single-phase motors. And we're told to do this by the code in 430.6A1 as in Apple. So 125% of 120 in the quick calc 1 comes up to 150 amps, so we need 1-aught conductors supplying the switch, the controller, and the motor. But the overcurrent device now, if you didn't have a solid state starter or some reduced starting method, resistant starting, whatever that you might be using, you'd say, no, I'm just going to size this overcurrent device to hold the inrush current of that motor under lock rotor conditions and starting conditions, and also hold it long enough to accelerate the load. So we would take the overcurrent device, and if they were fuses that we were sizing, then we know that 430.52 refers us to table 430.52, and we would pick up 175% from to size fuses. And we know without a doubt those fuses would be sized large enough to allow the motor to start and run and accelerate the driven load. So 175% of 120 is 210. And then notice our 430.52 C1 wouldn't let you round up. You'd have to round down to a 200 amp device below 210. But if the exception 1, which is automatically applicable by the designer or the installer, we could round up. So we could round up to a 225 amp set of fuses that would very definitely allow that motor to run. So if it was an irrigation pump, for example, you'd have a weather head, you'd have a transformer above it, conductors come down and terminate to the service entering conductors at the weather head down to the switch that you see in the drawing. And then from there you'd feed the controller, and then you would supply the irrigation pump. But notice, to be able to size that overcurrent device greater than 125% in your quick calc 1, quick calc 2 requires or allows the overcurrent device to be sized from above 125% up to 175%. And if that motor failed to start and accelerate the load and had nuisance tripping at different times, we could even go up to 225% times 120 by using the exception 2 to 430.52 C1, but you would have to round down then. So what the exception 1 to 230.90A allows is the overcurrent device to be sized greater than 125% of the motor's full load current from calc 1. We can size the overcurrent device at 175% using quick calc 2. And then table 240.4G instructs us, yes, that's the motor. You can size the overcurrent device larger to allow the motor to start and run. And that's what this exception 1 is allowing. Where that disconnect you see is service equipment, then we can do the very same thing that 240.4G would allow maybe if it was a branch circuit, say, or a feeder that we were using. So that's what your figure 6-43 is illustrating. Now, notice the note. The note says Section 230.90A, Exception 1 applies to one or more motors installed on the service. And it says, for more information, basically is what it's saying, see figure 15-11 and 18-12 in Volume 2 of Stallcup's Electrical Design Book. And notice we also give you the sizing of the disconnect. If you were using 225 amp fuses to comply with 230.90A Exception 1, that disconnect would be a 400 amp rated disconnect to be able to put 225 amp fuses in that disconnect. The disconnect naturally would have to disconnect the controller and motor, so it would have to comply with 430.109A1 for horsepower. It'd have to, for load break current, lock rotor current, starting current, running current, and so forth, 430.110A. The controller with the overloads then would have to make 430.83A1 and 430.32A1. Our service conductors to the left of the disconnect would be 1-aught, 150 amps, selected from 310.16. And if we had more than just one motor or two or more motors with other loads on a feeder or service, then 430.24 would also have to be used. So figure 6-43 is illustrating the use of the Exception 1 in accordance with 230.90A where motors are involved.